What is the most humane way of taking a human life? It's a tough question. America is debating it. They killed a man today, a death row prisoner. He was killed by nitrogen asphyxiation. The man was called Kenneth Smith. He was on death row for murder committed 3 decades ago. This morning, he was executed by nitrogen gas. Simply put, he was deprived of oxygen. He could breathe only nitrogen, so he suffocated and died. This was done in Alabama. They believed it's a humane way, a humane method for the death penalty. But the United Nations does not agree. They say it's an untested method and it amounts to torture. In 1982, the US shifted to lethal injections. So why did they feel the need to change? Also, how many countries still use the death penalty? Our next report has the answers.
On Thursday morning, Kenneth Smith had his last meal. It was eggs, steak and hash browns. Soon after, he was escorted to the execution room. Smith was tied to a gurney. He was made to wear a face mask. Minutes later, nitrogen gas was pumped into it. Smith struggled. He heaved back and forth. He was breathing heavy. He was writhing. He was pulling at the restraints. Nearly 22 minutes later, he was dead.
What we saw was minutes of someone struggling for their life. We saw minutes of someone heaving back and forth. We saw spit. We saw all sorts of stuff from his mouth develop on the mask. We saw this mask tied to the gurney and him ripping his head forward over and over and over again. And we also saw correction officials in the room who were visibly surprised at how bad this thing went.
Smith was convicted of murder in 1988. He was hired to kill the wife of a pastor. He's been on death row for 3 decades. Alabama has tried to execute him before. The state tried the go-to method, lethal injections, but it was called off at the last minute. Why? Because authorities could not find his vein. Which brings us to the second attempt. It's new. It's never been tried before. In this, the inmate is deprived of oxygen until they only breathe nitrogen. It's basically choking to your own death. But that makes it controversial.
It appeared that one Smith was holding his breath as long as he could, and then there's also information out there. He struggled against the restraints a little bit, but there's some involuntary movement and some agonal breathing, so that was all expected and is in the side effects that we've seen or researched on nitrogen hypoxia.
Alabama calls it the most painless and humane method, but the United Nations disagrees. It says the method is risky. It could lead to torture, or worse, non-fatal injuries. The UN says it's not been tested on humans. If the mask is not secured well, it could also leak. That could endanger the lives of others. The US introduced lethal injections in 1982. Since then, it's been the most common method of execution. The last US execution using gas was in 1999. Then they had used hydrogen cyanide gas. Which brings us to death penalties. 55 countries have it. 23 of them haven't used it for 10 years. 9 of these use it for only the worst of crimes. In 2022, at least 2,000 people were handed the death penalty. That year, global executions were also at a record high. 883 people are known to have been put to death, a 53% rise since 2021. These are the 11 countries that reportedly execute people. It includes the likes of China, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. In the US, there were 24 executions in 2023, 6 more than in 2022. Today, only 53% of Americans support the death penalty, the lowest level since 1972. So what methods do they use? Most countries choose hanging, lethal injections, or death by shooting. Saudi Arabia is the only one with beheading. The nitrogen asphyxiation was a first for the world. Alabama may defend it, But the world is not convinced by this execution style dubbed the guinea pig method.